It is lovely to be here in person and online. It's lovely to see you all here in person that I haven't seen for a long time. A few surprise faces, but good surprises. Let's open with a word of prayer. Dear God, we come before your throne of grace, thankful for the experience and journey we've been on thus far. As we grow and develop as a people, I pray that we may be on the path that you desire of us. I invite your presence as we contemplate on thoughts of importance in the grand scheme of things and in our day-to-day lives. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Over the course of this weekend, we will have 8 studies. 4 of them will be taken by myself. And at least my studies will be the development of thoughts that I've been trying to relay for the past few months in particular, specifically anchoring them to studies that started in Brazil in February of this year. However, as we recognize with truth, or at least I pray this is truth, the development has been for the last 35 or so years. And so I have a request that as we go through the 4 studies that we have together, I will touch on different aspects of the same subject. So, to help yourself, if you can keep different concepts in your mind at the same time, and see how they come together at the end. I think it was in 2024, we started at least explicitly understanding the relationship between our message of equality I'll use the term that we've used thus far, radical feminism, to explore the idea of something that is a principle that will change your life. By change your life, I mean change society. And in the context of that discussion, we've explored institutions. As our message has shifted from thinking of this as individuals, as part of the great controversy, to recognizing what we were raised up to do, which was understand the role of institutions in the great controversy. Last week, Elder Parminder did a study at IPR, and he explored the characteristics of this word institution. If we think of a definition for institution, it can be understood in two different ways. But these two different ways are not entirely different. They're related. So if you were to think of the human body, you have this outer shell, outer shell. So if you were to think of your limbs, so we were going over this idea of institutions. And I wanted to use an analogy to demonstrate the interaction between these two perspectives of institutions. So if we were to think of the human body composed of limbs, everything that you can see that houses the internal stuff, and your inner organs, those play a part in keeping you alive. But there's something underneath all of that exterior that tells those limbs what to do. Think of it as your DNA. So your DNA exists in those inner organs. It will exist in your outer organs. And they'll tell your body to do slightly different things at which point it's talking to. But there's an overarching theme that your DNA has within your body. So small differences, but the same. So let's take this and apply it to how institutions are constructed. A simple way of thinking of one definition of institution is as an organization. So if you think of the movement as an organization, this movement has different ministries spread across the world. So all these different ministries that I've marked up with M are your inner organs that come together to make this bigger whole body organ. But without your DNA, those organs don't know what to do. So all these different ministries have their own rules, their own ethos, and this wider organization, the movement, has its wider rules and its ethos. Whether you think of it as rules or this organization, both of them can be thought of as institutions. And these institutions work together. Without each other, they can't achieve anything. The reason why I bring this point up at the beginning of our studies is because as the weekend goes on, you'll hear the word institution thrown about, and it won't always be explicitly pointed out which type of institution is being spoken about. So you're going to have to juggle in your mind whether the speaker, myself, is talking about this organ or these invisible codes, the invisible rules. If you think of Romeo and Juliet, which we should all be familiar with now, after the aliens came to Earth, that play as a structure is your outer organ. But the invisible code that tells Romeo and Juliet about their love, their marriage, is that invisible institution that guides the play. So I hope that makes sense. The difference between the two types of institutions that exist. So if we take that, I wanted to put that in place because I want to start considering the 2520 as an institution. And what place and what role it serves our institution. So if you were to think of the parable of the mustard seed, for instance, you have this seed that's going to have certain life properties within it. And Ellen White will say it has a principle encoded in its DNA. And that principle is going to enable that mustard seed tree to do its job. That's the interaction of these two types of institutions. Those principles make it possible for this tree to do its job. And what was the job of that tree? Do we have a mic? Yeah. So if you're familiar with that parable, what was the specified job of the tree in Jesus' parable of the mustard seed? Raquel? Yeah, just shout it out. So Raquel said that the job of that tree was to provide protection. And it could only do that job if that life giving principle existed in its seed. That's the interaction we're talking about. So, considering the 2520, we've grappled with Leviticus 26 for many years now. I want to review some of the concepts of the 2520, not as an in depth study. You can do that by going onto PIP's website. They have a booklet about the 2520. But I just want to extract some of the things from that series of studies and build on them. So if we think about this time prophecy and its relationship to the scattering and gathering, the Millerites understood it in relationship to this covenant that God had with Israel. And there were blessings and cursings attached to that covenant. So I'll stick with one of the 2520s. The Southern Kingdom, that stretches from 677 BC to 1844, as when God's people start to be gathered again after this long scattering. So, from what you remember about those studies years back, what are some of the characteristics we mark once this gathering occurs? Yeah. So we have the scattering at the beginning. What are some of the things we would mark at the gathering? Think back to your history. Okay, I'll start. I'll list one. That God is going to restore their covenant people. So this covenant people broke the conditions of the covenant. So they're scattered. And at the end, they're going to be gathered. And this covenant is going to be got back into. What are some of the other things we would mark in 1844? Yeah.
I don't know if it's the same that you said, but I was thinking as you asked about it that it was like from 1798 to 1844, it was like a process. Oh, sorry.
Keep your sentences short and your answers short. Don't explain.
Yeah. To me, it was like a process. Who belongs and who doesn't want to belong.
Okay, so there's this covenant dimension. The investigative judgment of the dead. So there's a judgment that starts taking place. And at least the third one in my list is that the sanctuary starts being investigated and understood. The sanctuary being an institution. I hope that refreshes your memory. When we explored the 2520, we understood that the 2520 wasn't just a number. It's this legal judgment system that existed over God's people. The context of it is legality, the law. So, whatever you're going to understand about the gathering is tied to the scattering by what you understand the law to be and do. In relationship to these entities that are in this covenant. So, all those micro prophecies that you read about, the 1260, the blessing that comes after waiting, the 1335, they all lack context, they all lack meaning if not understood within the context of this covenant or the 2520. My point in saying all of that is to highlight the importance of understanding the 2520 beyond just a time prophecy. So let's do that. Let's go back to Leviticus 26 and try to understand what this covenant was built upon. Because we're interested in what the conditions of gathering are. In 1844, for sure, but today. And if God's people are going to be gathered, we'd want to know what the conditions of that gathering are. So I can see a hand. I'm not going to be able to take questions live unless they're clarifying questions. If you do have a question, please direct them to Aldeparminda, who will collate them. And we'll try to answer them through the weekend or after. So if we revisit Leviticus 26 to explore the 2520 in a bit more detail and its relationship to institutions, what we find in those first two verses, and I apologize to the translators, but I'll paraphrase those first two verses so you don't have to read them. After explaining everything about the sanctuary system and the law, in the previous chapters, God is going to capstone this by pointing out an if-then scenario. So if you do this, this will happen, and if you don't do this, that will happen. And so paraphrasing those first two verses, those conditions of this contract, God says, don't make any idols. Don't make any images of those idols. And don't raise them up in your land. And definitely don't bow down to them. And then God goes on to say, on top of that, keep my Sabbaths and make sure you respect my sanctuary. As with everything, this covenant that God is going into with Israel exists within a wider story. And without that context, it becomes difficult to put this covenant in its right framework. So these three conditions can mean two different things depending on whether you know the context or you don't. It's like laws. If you just read a law on a piece of paper, you don't know what it's related to or why it was given. Unless you know the wider context. So let's explore this wider context of why these three things, these specific institutions that God feels necessary to labor and codify in that contract. What problem was God trying to solve? So we know that this story is in the time period of their visit to Sinai. So Moses has gone up, got the 10 commandments, and God is going to elaborate on these conditions. So here's the Sinai story. What does it sit in the middle of? This is the context that we're interested in. Sophie?
So if I understood correctly, it's between the going out of Egypt. Tu peux parler un peu plus fort, s'il te plaît? And the entrance in Canaan.
So here these Israelites are. They've just left Egypt, a world, and they're about to enter into a different world. So they think a certain way, and they're about to enter into this other world. And God needs to both deal with the world that they came from and make sure that they have protections when going into the world they're going to. I hope that makes sense. So that's your context. And with that context, we can start understanding why these three institutions. Because if we see what these two worlds have in common, Egypt and Canaan, then when we read when God says no idols, we don't look at it as a command of jealousy, of God saying, I want you to be all mine for myself. And when you pray, I'm the only one that should get your prayers because I'm jealous. So that's a perspective we can look at things. But I'm going to suggest that an alternative perspective of looking at this institution that God set up wasn't for God's benefit because God was lonely. It was for their benefit, given the world that they're about to go into. So what did Egypt look like? I said these two worlds are similar. What kind of place was Egypt? How did power exist in Egypt? So you had your Pharaoh, and you had all these other gods existing in the ether. So their social system was legitimized through these gods that existed. So if you were to think of some of those gods, there's Ra, there's Horus, there's Osiris, and they all play a function in humans' life. And Pharaoh if you were to say, is the face of this divinity, ends up putting the authority that comes from Pharaoh beyond human challenge. So if you go up to Pharaoh and you say, Pharaoh, I don't like the way you're running things, who are you addressing? You're not addressing Pharaoh. You're telling the gods, I don't like the way you're running things. So power in Egypt, in this polytheistic system, was underwritten by this many gods system. So when the Israelites complained, Pharaoh took offense because Pharaoh is God, a god. And who are you, a human, to challenge godly authority? So all these gods that existed in this social order work together to perpetuate slavery. This unequal power structure between humans. So you have different classes in society because they have different relationships to the different gods. So in this many god system, you can't challenge your enslaver because your enslaver is working for these gods. So when Israel leave Egypt, the way they relate to each other and the world around them has been systematically built to get them to think like this. That this is how power operates between each other and us and God. It's this slave mindset that the Israelites leave Egypt with. And we've explored this when we've talked about the Apis ball. That the anger that God had wasn't necessarily because it was a calf. It was this thinking of what the Israelites had about power. What about Canaan? What situation do you have in Canaan? You think of Edom, Moab, the Amorites, and all these different nations, nation tribes. What was the God situation there? Again, Raquel?
Every nation has his own God.
So Raquel pointed out that it's the same problem in a different form. So you have many gods, and each of these tribes or entities, these cities, are going to find a god that they can live with. So you have this, again, polytheistic society. Which means many gods. And what was the relationship between these cities with these many gods? So here's one city. Here's your other. 3 different cities with 3 different gods. Did they like each other? Did they get along? They didn't. Sophie, why didn't they get along?
I guess it was to know which god was the strongest.
So each of these different gods, I won't use the word strongest, because yeah, it was a battle between their gods. But each of these different gods ran their small little cities in different ways. So Sophie's city had certain laws, and Emma's city had a different set of laws of what would be acceptable in her city. And then Vadim's city had its own set of laws. So here's Sophie, here's Emma, and here's Vadim. And when Sophie wants to attack Emma and take over Emma's city, she's telling those citizens, your life is going to change because my laws are different to the other god that you had. And to make it worse, one city had several gods. And each of these gods had different standards of justice, different laws. So God, knowing this, says, no more of this many gods and many laws system, because it leads to this conflict between the ways of life that you see. And so what role does God say I'm going to serve now? I won't quote any verses. God has many hats, we know that. But one of the primary things God constantly reminds the Israelites of is that I am your lawgiver. So here's God and says, I'm going to be your judge and lawgiver. So instead of creating a society with many lawgivers that lead to different standards of justice, I'm going to do something radically different. one God. Because by having one God, your society, Israel, will have one standard of justice for everyone. Not many lawgivers with many standards of justice, just one. So when we think of no idols, God is trying to instill this idea in these people that everyone, when they look at the law, should receive equal judgment. Whether it's a native or a foreigner, or you're rich in society, rich, yeah, or poor, that law should look at you blindly. Because there's only one now, not many. So, this idolatry institution, I'm suggesting, is not God saying, I'm so jealous, please don't go and worship other people. It's God saying, if you are going to survive as a people and not descend into the barbarism you see around you, let's just have one standard of justice where all are viewed equal in the eyes of the law. Does that first one make sense? The second institution that God labors in those first two verses is the Sabbaths. Keep my Sabbaths. And if you notice, it says Sabbaths, plural. So not specifically related to the seventh day Sabbath. So if we think of this bundle term, Sabbaths, and the Jewish economic system, this calendar had many Sabbaths throughout the year, related to the different festivals that occur. So for sure, there was the weekly Sabbath that we're familiar with. But tied to various festivals, as I said, God would say, rest during that festival. So have a Sabbath. There was the Sabbath of years. So every seventh year, the land would rest. And there was the Jubilee. So what would happen on the Jubilee? This grand Jubilee. The land and the people would rest. So embedded into this economic calendar, it wasn't only about a worship dynamic. If you remember, if you got into a deal with someone and that deal didn't work out for you, you could sell your land because you needed to pay back the person you owe. And you'd become their servant. God had two different models for this people that God is trying to make sure survive. What would happen after a cycle to those servants and their land? They were liberated. So they would get their land back and they could leave their servitude contract. Think of it like a social safety net. So you get into hard times to ensure that you don't stay in those hard times and your family doesn't stay in those hard times. This social safety net was weaved into their economic system. So if you think of these Sabbaths as economic and social welfare, you can, I hope, see how this institution gets placed into this contract at an underlying principle level to protect their labor and economic rights of the people. Because if those people's rights are respected, or should I say protected, sorry, the system can survive. Does that make sense? Of how this institution is related to their human relationships, aside from being about worship. And then the third one was sanctuary. Hopefully this one should be easier to see. Because what was the sanctuary all about? What did you go to the sanctuary to do? It was all about law. Was this mini courtroom? Courthouse. It God ensured that it was the center of their civilization. Sure, because God was lonely and wanted to be with their people, but that the law was the center of their society. If you remember, they've just come out of this oppressive system. So this headquarters of their legal, economic, and social system ends up housing that law that the lawgiver gives. Without going through verses to prove what I'm going to say, Moses articulates, just like the first institution we spoke about, that a key part of the sanctuary is that there's one law for all. So an equality of standards. If you were someone who sinned, so you are rich, you're a priest, or you're poor, there wasn't anything that barred access to forgiveness. All could go to that sanctuary, or at least approach God through that system and ask for forgiveness, which demonstrated the equal worth amongst all individuals in society. Equal moral worth for all in society. So every person had the right to atonement through this, with this equity system. So if you're poor, you brought less. And if you are rich, you brought what was equal to your wealth. Whether you were in leadership as a priest, or one of the counselors or elders that sat among above the tribes, leadership all bowed down to the law. So the law didn't care if you were a leader or not. So no one was above the law or this system, this sanctuary system. And then lastly, which is just a subcategory of that, is that, like I said about the priests, the religious leaders or religious elite didn't own the nation. They served it, remembering the system that they just came out of from Egypt, where the different classes in society were created by this unequal system created by the many gods. My point about going through these three different laws or institutions is that they were all encoded to solve one problem. The Israelites thinking about law and equality amongst themselves and those around them. But God has a problem. God wants to teach them this principle of equality. So here's your principle. But they're so damaged that God has to hide it to trick them. trick them. Or should I say, to teach them slowly. Because this idea of equality amongst everyone was so foreign to them. So it had to be baked into the system, into these different areas of their life, without it being explicit. That's where we read about the shadow and God trying to teach an underlying principle. Elder Parminders made the comment about the 10 Commandments being examples. So if we were to think of those 10 examples, what would we do with them? How would we divide them up? Into the 4 and the 6. And what did we say about the 4? That they're dealing with what aspect of the cosmos? The relationship between humans and God. So those first 4 will teach you about your relationship between humans and God. And these 6 will teach you about your relationship between humans and humans. And your 6 will guide your 4. Do you remember how we've constructed that? For yourself, re-look at those 4 commandments of no idols, no graven images, the Sabbath, and respect. What was God trying to teach them from those 4 commandments? I went through the aspect of the covenant, and those 3 institutions to try and make the point that that was never about humans' relationship with God. It was always about teaching humans how to relate with humans. So instead of 4 commandments teaching us about God, they end up being 10 commandments that teach us about humanity. And we should have known that. When Jesus told us that I gave you the Sabbath for you, not for me. And you can just extrapolate that concept onto the other 3 commandments, the other 3 examples. So you end up with 10 examples with 10 commandments that are not dealing with God. They're dealing with humanity, society. In trying to hammer home this point, about equality under the law. Did that make sense? How we got to that conclusion? Because then it ends up being all these 10 commandments teach you about humanity. And then holistically, we can learn about God. But if we think of those first four as dealing with God, we lose what God is trying to teach us.
Considérons ces quatre commandements comme traitant uniquement de Dieu, on passe à côté de ce que Dieu souhaite nous enseigner.
We started our discussion or this study
C'est notre discussion, notre étude,
in exploring the scattering and the gathering.
la dispersion et le rassemblement.
And we said that this gathering takes place in 1844.
Rassemblement a eu lieu en 1844.
So if these institutions led to a scattering, the breakdown of these institutions,
Nous amène à ce rassemblement, le détail de ces institutions.
what needs to be restored for any gathering to take place?
Être restauré pour que n'importe quel rassemblement puisse avoir lieu.
An understanding of these same institutions.
Ces mêmes institutions.
So the restoration of these institutions amongst the covenant people.
Le peuple de l'Alliance.
And these institutions relate to human relationships.
Sont en lien avec les relations humaines.
If any gathering is going to take place.
Le monde qui doit avoir lieu.
So what we can take with this structure, as we saw at the beginning that this marks the investigative judgment of the dead, is we can bring two things together. So here's 1844. And we can line it up with another investigative judgment that we expect at the end of the world. Which is the investigative judgment of the living. Which commences when? At the Sunday law. I won't prove that now. But if you just take my word for it. And we said if the gathering is going to take place so that the judgment of the dead can take place, what needed to be restored? Those institutions. So amongst the covenant people at the end of the world, these same institutions need to be restored. If the judgment of the living is going to take place. Not just restoration in a generic sense, because as I tried to demonstrate, these institutions relate to the law. But it's a complete and comprehensive understanding of the law that allows any judgment to be capable. If any judgment is going to take place at the end, the law needed to be understood. This waymark we mark as the Sunday law is not just about a political event that happens, but it points to a time pointed in the past where we needed to come to an understanding of the law as it related to equal rights for this dispensation of judgment to start taking place. So my time is nearly up. But one thing we saw with this structure about 1844 was that this 25-20 time period connected two events. So if we mark the Sunday law in 2024 and we look back at our, if you were to say sub 25-20, or our, just a different way of looking at the 25-20, I'll say it that way. And we explore the year 1898. Politically, the United States relationship with the world changed. But for Adventism, it marked the capstone of a work that Ellen White had been doing for decades, which was exploring the life of Christ when Desire of Ages was published. 10 years earlier, Jones and Wagner came with their revolutionary message. Of righteousness by faith. And that should have prompted the church to understand prophecy correctly in its relationship to the third angel's message. But they're spiritually blind. And it takes Ellen White telling them that this message of Christ in you, the hope of glory, is the third angel's message, for them to start thinking about it. But they don't get the point. So they're unable to recognize the world around them. So when Ellen White publishes Desire of Ages, I'm suggesting that that should have been a turning point for Adventism in understanding Christ in you, the hope of glory. But we end up in this spiritual scattering. And at the end, this gathering, if God is going to go into covenant with a people, the restoration of these institutions we spoke about needs to happen. And connecting the dots we should have connected 126 years before. Which was seeing the connection between the third angel's message, I'll just say Sunday law, and equality, which we've done. That institution has been restored. And so now we can understand judgment in its right place. So as we go through the rest of the weekend, I hope you are able to see the thread through the studies in thinking about the law in its right place. how that could never have occurred without this waymark that we call the Sunday law, and understanding it correctly as it relates to equality. I'll just do a brief summary. So I started off by exploring institutions and the relationship between these invisible institutions and organizations, and how if this organization is going to have life, the invisible institutions or rules need to work together to achieve something. That's what creates this durability. And so, with that in mind, I wanted to explore the 2520 as an institution, to try to understand what God was doing with those people that came out of Egypt. From one angle, we can look at those terms and conditions as just relating to God and God's jealousy, which they are. But I wanted to try and point out that these institutions were created for our benefit, primarily, and humanity's protection. In that context, for Israel's protection. So if we take that concept, we can look at the 10 Commandments in the same way. That those 4 commandments are not really about God, at least in the way we would describe them normally. And instead, we can see them as encoding equality under the law. For the benefit of humans. Going back to where we started about this idea of scattering and gathering, if the breakdown of these institutions led to a scattering, which is just a change of environment, by the way, then any gathering that takes place necessitates the restoration of those institutions for the judgment of the dead to occur and the judgment of the living. One thing we didn't do, which in the future I hope we do, is think about whether this judgment of the dead and living is about people or institutions. I hope you can see without me proving it now that it's about institutions. Institutions being judged, not people, because that's what's being restored. So let's close now with a word of prayer. And my second study will be tomorrow. We'll pick it up from here. Dear God, as I said at the beginning, thank you for your work in bringing us to a point where we could understand the law correctly. Put in its right place. In enshrining this equality under the law principle. Thank you for your patience and your labor, your protections and your continual service. I praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.